My name is Eric Hayden. I'm a rose grower across Eastern North Carolina. This presentation today is going to talk a little bit about how you can enjoy your roses. I know here in Eastern North Carolina and through a lot of the Carolinas right now, we're seeing our blooms and we're getting close to peak bloom. For those of you up north, you may say, hey, we don't have roses yet, but this is a presentation that everybody can enjoy because they'll really teach you how you can make your rose blooms last longer, and we'll talk a little bit more about how things you should be doing in the garden once we get past this peak bloom. Couple of reminders, you can always see more videos like this on our YouTube channel, so certainly enjoy those videos. We have a lot of different topics that we cover. But again, the presentation today, given our situation, our normal meeting for the Eastern North Carolina Rose Society is the first Saturday of the month. We've transitioned to virtual presentations. We did one on how to plan your rose bed, and we also did one on how you can start your rose gardens and different things that you can use in the garden itself, especially for smaller gardens. You can find all of that information on the bottom of the screen just by going to the YouTube channel you're on right now. So we're going to talk a little bit about this presentation. Is going to really cover rose blooms and when you should cut them, ways to preserve them. But before we get too much further into the presentation, I want to really encourage you to join your local society or the American Rose Society. Roses can be tricky to grow. You may have some questions, and nothing beats having a local society that can give you some information in terms of tips and tricks, especially if you have any issues with disease or what to grow in the area. Really benefit to join the American Rose Society at the national level and also the local society itself. It can really help you out quite a bit. As far as tonight's presentation, again, we're going to go over how to cut roses, when is the best time to cut. It's going to be a short presentation, but I think you're going to be surprised how much can go into rose growing and how you can be successful. We're going to talk about displaying roses and then also encouraging the next cycle of blooms after you get done with your rose blooms. So first thing, what should you use? You want to have a good type of garden shears. You don't want just regular scissors. You don't want anything dull because that will actually cut the rose cane itself and injure it. So you want something very sharp. This is something you want to spend some money on. Sometimes you may try to save a nickel here and there, but rose shears are one thing you don't want to do that. You want to buy something that's high quality, will last. If you can, buy something to sharpen them as well, because you want to keep them as sharp as possible, maintain them so they last a while. So first step, you have to have some good garden shears. Now we're going to talk about steps 2 through 5. The first one, when and where should you cut your roses? The time of day is extremely important. Roses open up mostly between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. That's the peak heating of the day. So when you go out in the morning, that's a really good time to cut because the rose hasn't opened up a lot overnight. So that's a good time to cut. That's where there's a lot of water in the petals themselves, so it has a lot of substance. The other good time to cut would be in the evening. So again, the cooler parts of the day. First thing in the morning, in the evening are much preferred because the rose itself, the bloom, has a lot of water in it, has a lot of substance. You do not want to cut it in the middle of the heat. Certainly not in the middle of the day or the early part of the afternoon. That's probably the worst time you can do it. The reason for that, again, not a lot of water in the petals themselves. The other thing you want to pay attention to is something called the degree of openness. You will notice that some roses open really, really quick, and other roses open really, really slow, and you kind of need a crowbar to pry them open. Your roses that have less petals tend to open faster. Mr. Lincoln is one. Beautiful red rose. It's very, very fragrant, but it can go from a very tight bud to completely open within a day. So those types of roses, you want to cut what's called a little tighter, a little bit more closed. This rose pictured here is called a firm. That's a rose that tends to open much more slowly. It has a lot of petals. Moonstone is another one. A lot of petals. Those roses, you want them to open up just a little bit more. So your degree of openness is important. Tighter cut when it's a smaller amount of petals and in a more open cut when you have a lot of petals. And it may be a lot of information for you. Just observe your roses. You'll notice some of them open really quick and other ones open a little slower. So that will kind of help you out. Again, if they open slower, maybe let them get a little bit more open once they're out in the garden. Weather is a huge factor. If we have a big storm coming, if it's going to rain, if it's going to be really windy, go out to your garden and cut those blooms. They could get damaged in the storm. They're not going to look as good. So weather plays a big role. Weather also plays a role on opening. By and large, again, first thing in the morning, in the evening, by far the best times to cut those blooms. But you'll also notice if it's been a really warm and humid night, those blooms are going to open really quickly. So if you have that, if you have a warm and humid night, take a look at your garden first thing in the morning. I think you'll be surprised how open those blooms can be. The last part of step 2 is where should you cut it? So as you look at the bloom, you want to go down the cane and you want to go to the first set of 5 leaves. Right near the top, there'll be a set of 3. Ideally, you want to go a little bit farther down. And the reason for that is out of that set of 5 leaves, you'll have a real healthy bud eye. That will be your next cane for your next bloom. Can you cut it at the set of 3 leaves? Yes. Is there a bud eye there? Yes. But by and large, the ones that are a little bit lower on the cane near the set of 5 leaves are better. And I'll have another explanation of that at the end. But go down into your first set of 5 leaves and give it a cut, and that will be good. This is a good time to mention stem length. So if you go down to your first set of 5 leaves, you have a pretty short stem, and you can see that here on the pictures. I cut my roses pretty short. The reason for that is if you cut a lot of blooms, it can be detrimental to the bush itself, especially if it's a new one. If you've only planted it in the last year or two, take a couple blooms off the bush. Enjoy them, give them to friends and neighbors, and display them in your house. But keep your stems low. You don't want really long stem roses because you're removing a lot of foliage, and that foliage provides energy for the rose. So again, you don't want to hack your bush. If you want a long stem rose here and there, that's fine, but especially newer roses, you want them to be short stems, and the reason for that, again, is think of those leaves like solar panels. They really provide energy for the bush, and if you're removing all the leaves, it's not going to have a lot of energy. Step 3, so you know to cut it first thing in the morning, perhaps in the evening. We just went over where to cut first set of 5 leaves, kind of shorter stems if you can. Now, you put them in your vase. You want them to last many days, if not a week or longer. What can you use in your vase? The first thing is just plain old water. You'll see this medicine dropper here. I use that to even raise the glass itself even more to top it off with water. If you do cut your roses in the garden, I try to get them in water as quickly as possible. One other tip that I don't always do, but it can help. If you recut the rose underwater, that keeps any air bubbles from going up the stem itself. So cut them in the garden, early evening, first thing in the morning, first set of 5 leaves, get them in water right away. And if you have time, have a little bowl of water and recut them underwater once you're back inside. And the reason for that, again, it can prolong the vase life because you don't have any air getting up into the stems. Plain water is fine. There's nothing wrong with plain water. You can use additives which will prolong the vase life. I have a bunch of these packets. These are the same things that you get at the grocery store or your florist shop. So you can pick up a couple extra. They work very well. You can also order them online. Typically, they have 3 things in them. One is sugar, and that is to open up the bloom and make it, open up nicely. The second one they usually have is some type of, not necessarily bleach, but a disinfectant. You want to keep bacteria down in the water. And the third thing they often have is an acidifier, a more acidic water. The rose bloom itself will actually take up more water in acidic water. There are homemade recipes to make this type of solution. I've done it before. Again, a little bit of sugar, a teensy bit of bleach, and a little bit of vinegar for the acidity. So you can certainly make that at home. There's another type. This is called a preserver. I'm into rose shows, so I use this when I want to, say, cut a bloom on a Monday or Tuesday, and I'm entering a show on a Saturday. I'll put it in this preserver, and put it in a refrigerator. That's a little more high tech, but I just want to mention it. I would stick with making your own packets or buying some packets online. But again, plain water works just fine. We're getting toward the end of the presentation. We talked about when you should cut your blooms, how you should cut your blooms. We talked about what type of water you could use or some additives. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what do you do with them? How do you display them? There's many different types of vases. Some of these nicer vases I've won at rose shows. Occasionally I'll use those, but again, those would want a long stem rose, and I usually don't cut my roses very long. There are other things you can have, perhaps even around the house itself. We certainly talk about, different ways to display them. This is a clay holder for it. One of my bosses, his cousin, actually makes different types of clay and features and stuff like that. So this is a nice way to display it. I like to reuse what I have. This is one that I use the most. My wife and daughter drink these little coffee drinks that are in glass jars that are really, really small. I like them very, very much because they don't need a long stem rose. When I give them away to people, they can be carried in a holder of 4, and they hold just enough water and they transport really well. Speaking of that, give away your roses. If you're like me and you have more than a few bushes, you like to share with friends and family. Who doesn't like to get a bouquet of roses? So think about how you would transport them. I really like these smaller jars. They come in a 4-pack. Again, I can carry it as a 4-pack. It has a flat, stable bottom, so I can put it on the floor mat of my car and it doesn't tip around. And those bottles are nice because they go in my cup holders. So that's another nice way to transport them. So we're just about toward the end here. Again, this is supposed to be a little shorter than a normal presentation because I can't see how much you're paying attention. Hopefully you're enjoying it. We're to step 5. And the last step is, okay, you know when to cut them. Now you know how to cut them, what to put in the water, how to display them. Now you're done. In about 5 to 7 weeks from now, you're going to have a new cycle of blooms. And what I mean by that is roses bloom over a 2 to 3 week window. We call this a peak or a flush of roses. So our peak here in Eastern North Carolina is roughly from the last week of April through about the middle part of May. Can you have a few stragglers after that? Yes. Can you have a few stragglers before that? Yes. But by and large, that's our 3-week window depending on the weather. Then 5 to 7 weeks later, you'll have another flush of roses come into the garden. And you can do some things to encourage that. It's going to happen regardless, but did you cut your blooms right? And this is a picture of going down just to the set of 3 leaves. It's a smaller bud eye. Often they're not as developed. So again, try to go down to that set of 5 if you can. There is another step you can do called deadheading, and all that is it's a fancy term for removal of blooms. So any of those blooms in the garden that you don't get in a vase and you don't give away, they'll eventually die. The petals will fall off and a new bud eye will shoot out and will start your new cane and new rose in about 5 to 7 weeks. But if you leave it on the bush, the rose is going to try to go to seed and it thinks its job of reproducing is done. So if you cut those roses off, deadhead, remove spent blooms, that encourages the rose to kind of get on with things, produce that bud eye, produce the cane, and eventually flower. Mother Nature will produce a flower regardless. So if you don't deadhead, again, it's okay. But if you want to encourage growth quicker, remove the spent blooms, then you can move on to the next set of blooms. And you may speed things up by a week or 2, depending on the bush itself. The last thing I'll talk about before we wrap it up is this is the time to do your second round of fertilization. So once these next 3 weeks are done, and I know we have folks watching from New York and other places, so you'll just have to tailor this to you. It's probably early to mid-June is your flush. So after your flush, after your 2 to 3 week window of a lot of blooms, that's when you want to put down a new round of fertilization. This is really a good time for organics. So I've got some rose tone on there, cottonseed meal, alfalfa meal, anything that's going to break down over many, many weeks. This is a good time to put it down because what you're doing now is you're building that soil back up. So as the rose continues to grow into the summer and new blooms form, 5 to 7 weeks later, they're going to have plenty of food for them to grow. All right, so that's just about it. It was short and sweet, about 15 minutes. I appreciate everybody joining us. If you're from a local society, share these videos. Even when we get back to being able to have in-person meetings, I still think this is a nice way to share our information with a different platform over social media like YouTube, and we'll certainly share this on Facebook. If you want more information, we've been scrolling it at the bottom throughout the presentation. You can find more on this YouTube channel. I try to make a couple videos a week. Nothing special in terms of production value. What I focus in on is what is happening in the garden. Am I dealing with black spot, spider mites? Am I dealing with drought, weeding, drip irrigation? Whatever I'm dealing with in the garden, I talk about. So encourage you to check that out. I have videos going back to last spring, and you'll see, the ups and downs of the rose garden and how it can be a lot of fun. So I appreciate you joining us tonight. I hope you learned a little bit about cutting blooms. There's probably more than you thought. Review the video, and again, those tips will help you make sure the blooms last longer. And if we're going to grow roses, they can be difficult. We may as well enjoy them. Don't forget to share them with family and friends and neighbors. Nothing beats a fresh cut of bouquet of roses from the garden. Have a great night, and we'll talk to you soon.